Hi everyone, welcome to Write by Mia. I'm Mia, and in this Writer's Life video, I will be talking about my experience writing different types of genres. The idea for this video actually came to me when I got back from my honeymoon, and I was thinking of other content I could post to my website, and I eventually landed on writing vignettes. And it made me think a lot about the different types of writing that I have done, why I do it, and what I've learned from these different genres and how they've helped me become a better writer and explore different creative parts of myself. So in this video, I'm going to go through just a few of the different genres I've experimented with, what I've learned, and what I'm hoping to do more creatively in the future. So first, why do different types of genres? Why not just stick with the genre that is best for you? And I think for me, and this may not be for every author, but for me, it's really important to get outside of your comfort zone while writing. I think too often, if we're familiar with a genre or style of writing, it's harder for us to think of creative ways to break the mold, think of creative ways to develop different characters or plots or settings. So in creating or thinking about different genres and writing in those genres, it actually helps you in your principal genre, I think, because you're coming to it with a fresh perspective, whether that's how you're utilizing language, how you're thinking about a story, or even how you're thinking about character development and characters. So for me, that's kind of what I go into, the mindset that I go into these different genres with is, what am I learning? What different skill am I learning in this genre that I can then bring to my, primary genre? So I would say the primary genre I write in is fiction, and that has been both through short stories, as many of you have read, and novel writing. So that is the genre I'm most comfortable with. And when I talk about these other genres that I've experimented with or thought about, I definitely will harken back to how they've helped me in, my fiction writing and how I'm hoping to utilize those skills going forward. So the first genre that I've experimented with and that has actually taught me a lot is poetry. I am so amazed by poets. I took a couple of poetry classes while in school, and I've only dabbled in it a handful of times, but it's really one of those genres that is really special because it forces you to be so intentional about everything. And of course, there is a freedom in poetry that may not necessarily be, as dominant in prose. You can play with the structure. You can kind of play with what the poem is about. There are really different ways to get your meaning across in poetry and ways that maybe aren't as open in prose. So when I came to poetry kind of for the first time, I was definitely like late teens. It was later in my life. I had been writing kind of regular long form prose. I was actually really intimidated because I was like, how am I going to make like poetry, maybe, 50 words on a page? How will that impact someone? What can I even write about? Like, how do I even go about this? And I think when I was writing, those handful of poems in class or even just on my own, what really forced me to become better and to really hone was, as I said before, just the intentionality behind every single word. So unlike prose, in my experience, I kind of had the space to like build out character, build out plot, and it's not as if I had to pay attention to every, single word I wrote, every, period, every comma, every apostrophe, because there was room to build out those things. But in poetry, because you have such a limited space, every letter, every word becomes so intentional, and it really made me stop and focus on what was truly important and what would make the most impact, because you have such a limited space for the reader to engage with what you're giving them, right? So in poetry, I think I really came away with it with a deeper appreciation of intentionality behind wording, and how much space I was taking up with my language and with my characters, because poetry doesn't allow you that space, and so you really have to be concise and be sure about what you're committing to and what you're putting on the page, which is something I really like. And, congrats to all the poets out there who can make beautiful art, because that was a really hard time for me to even think about doing poetry like that. So that would be the first thing. Poetry, the genre, just has helped me become more intentional and more focused in my own writing, and really thinking about the space that I'm taking up with words, characters, plot, all of that. The second type of genre that I kind of haven't had as much time with or as much experience with, but that I think has been helpful as well, is nonfiction. I've always been a fiction girl. I love reading fiction. I love writing fiction. That's basically what I write. But for me, nonfiction is important because it really brings the storyteller out of you. And I'll tell you why. So people think nonfiction is like pretty straightforward. You're just telling what happens in your life, right? These things actually happen. It doesn't really require a lot of creative drive because it's not as if you're thinking of new characters or new worlds or new plots. You're just kind of framing what has happened to you, someone you know, whatever, right? But I think it's so hard. And the reason I think nonfiction is so hard is because it's one thing to kind of give a list of events, but you have to make that engaging for the reader because no one really wants to read, I went to the store and then I saw my friend and then my friend and I talked about something, right? You need to tell a story within whatever the nonfiction is. So I will say that a lot of my fiction is based on real life, and those of you who have read my stuff will know that. So they kind of became combined in a way sometimes, but I think focusing specifically on nonfiction is really difficult because you kind of want to bring in a creative spin or something that would engage the reader more, or figuring out ways to make something mundane sound interesting. And so nonfiction really helped me with my storytelling capabilities in transforming something that may seem mundane or ordinary or quotidian to something that's really engaging and unique and cool, right? So for that, I'm thankful for nonfiction, for one, melding with my fiction preference, and two, I guess helping me be more creative, and that I had to think of ways to tell a story that was outside of the norm. So that's what I would say about nonfiction. The third and final genre that I kind of dabble in or think about, and it's a bit of a cheat because it's a subgenre of fiction, is fantasy. And when I was in middle school, I really enjoyed reading fantasy. I wrote a little bit of fantasy when I was that age, but as I got older, I got more into literary fiction and I hardly read fantasy. But the reason I'm bringing it up now is because I've recently gotten into reading more fantasy, read Octavia Butler and K. Jemisin, and I think for me, this subgenre of fantasy is so important because the creative element is like on a whole nother level. Reading sci-fi or fantasy, it's literally a whole world that these authors have to build, whole societies, whole peoples, and I think that really just brings up broader societal questions that you can tackle through fantasy that maybe wouldn't be as easy or as apparent in, realistic fiction. But when I think of fantasy, when I've dabbled in it, it's really hard for me because, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of my fiction is based on real life. So having that creative capacity to create something that is completely different from what you've known or is completely unknown and only exists in your imagination and in your head, I think really forces me, in my experience, to get past my comfort zone and think outside of the box beyond, my family or my relationships or living in New York, living in the US. So though it is a subgenre, unlike poetry and nonfiction, I think it is really helpful in expanding my creative capacities as I think of new ways and creative ways to engage readers in my fiction writing, even though it is more realistic. So those are sort of the three genres and subgenre I've dabbled in and the reasons why they've helped me in my fiction journey and my writing journey. And for those who are writing, who are watching this, I think it is super important to write outside your comfort zone because one, you definitely can get burnt out if you're just focusing on one type of writing, one genre. And two, you will one, learn to appreciate the writers who are rock stars in those different types of genres. And you'll really see a difference coming back to your primary genre when you've been able to dabble in or experiment with other genres. So highly recommend, if you're a poet, try fiction. If you're nonfiction, try poetry. I think it just really helps bring that freshness and uniqueness back to your writing, and just helps you be the best creative, the best writer that you can be. Because you should always be learning, right? You should always be learning and growing. And I think switching up genres is a great way to do that. And I'm really glad I've had the chance to do that and have great people in my life and writers who, have encouraged me to do that. So thank you all again for listening. I love spending time with you all. These videos come out pretty frequently, so be on the lookout. Make sure to like and subscribe. And that's all I have for you. Thanks so much. Talk to you soon.